Work out all right. We're having some discussions with instructional support out there as to whether they're going to help us out a little bit. So I want to thank you all for coming today. It's a special day in that we are going to listen to Damayanti Chakraborty talk about her research that she's done towards her PhD degree. Hopefully everybody got a chance to pick up one of those flyers that provide some background information about Damayanti and her prior training and some of the things that she's accomplished since she's been here. To begin with, Damayanti got her undergraduate degree from Presidency College in Calcutta, and then a master's degree in biochemistry from the University of Calcutta, and then subsequently joined us here at the University of Kansas into the IGPBS program, and then early on came to my laboratory where she's been since. It has, I guess, during the time that Damayanti's been here, just been really exceptional in terms of a graduate student. And I was trying to, reflect as to what would be the most meaningful things to try to say, during this introduction. And what I wanted to comment about was, with regard to a mentor and a student or a trainee, there are some qualities that make things very helpful, and I think Damayanti certainly has those qualities, and that includes obviously intelligence, a really strong work ethic, really enthusiasm for research. And I think also finally some confidence. Confidence to not be afraid to be successful, and also confidence to challenge. Challenge your mentor sometimes, and also just challenge the existing dogma. So I think Damayanti has really is very strong in each of those categories. And I think that at least our interaction and her our experience in the laboratory, I think that she's really done outstanding work, and I think that she's destined to really do some good things in the future as well. So I think we'll go ahead and turn things over to Damayanti, and she's going to go ahead and talk to us about her work about natural killer cells and hypoxia and the development of the hemachorial placenta. Damayanti.
Can you hear me all right?
Nice.
Thank you, Mike, for this really kind introduction. So from inception to birth, the placenta forms this very important connection between the mother and the fetus and is responsible for the fetal development. Today, my talk is kind of outlined into this following topics. I'll be talking a little bit, giving a general introduction, then I'm going to move on to some of the regulators of placentation, and finally some future directions and some little thoughts for you. Introduction. So the placenta is a transient organ. As I told before, connects the mother with the fetus. It's extremely essential for exchange of nutrient gases between the mother and the fetus. In the class Mammalia, the eutherians are the placental mammals, and there can be different kinds of placentation within the eutherians. The hemachorial placentation, which is shared by us, the primates, as well as rodents, is by far the most invasive form of placentation. Here is a cartoon depicting a pregnant mom's uterus with a little fetus. This is the placental attachment, and these are the maternal arteries. I'm going to go back and forth into this model, but this is the bigger picture of a human placentation. If you really look at a cross-section of hemocorial placentation, it's a dynamic site which is characterized by extensive vascular remodeling by these trophoblast cells, which are the functional units of placenta. They move out of the placenta, remodel the maternal vessels, which we saw earlier, turning them into flaccid, low-resistance vessels. And why do we need this? This particular adaptation is extremely important for the exchange of nutrients between the maternal compartment, mother, and the fetus. So as the pregnancy progresses, there is progressive vascular remodeling by these invasive trophoblast cells, which I reiterate, move out of the placenta and remodel the maternal vasculature. There are a number of players implicated in this critical process. The key players are, which I'm going to talk about throughout my talk, are the natural killer cells and the invasive trophoblast lineage. So why do we need to be interested in this? There are a number of pregnancy-associated disorders commonly known as the preeclampsia syndrome, which is characterized by inefficient trophoblast invasion and vascular remodeling, leading to, as I mentioned, non-flaccid vessels which do not facilitate exchange, which overall leads to a lower perfused placenta, fetal hypoxemia, and in the maternal side, it's much more severe. It can cause mild to severe cardiovascular complications, and in the fetus side, intrauterine growth restriction. This is an actual image from one of the germ placentas, this is the normal placentation site. You see a vessel, it's beautifully remodeled, it's huge, it's flaccid, but when we look at the preeclamptic vessel, you can barely see the opening of the vessel, and the vessel still retains the thick, smooth muscle actin layer. Some statistics, these are pretty shocking. Preeclampsia and one of its sisters, the more severe type, eclampsia, causes like 30% of all maternal deaths. It occurs in 5 to 8% of all the pregnancies, which is almost a whopping 6.6 million women affected, and it's one of the major causes of 15% of the premature births. Interestingly, abnormal trophoblast behavior, particularly the differentiation and abnormal NK cell function, has been implicated in these disease syndrome. I'll be using animal models, particularly the rat model, so I want you to get familiarized what I really like about this model. So during implantation, in the rat, there is destabilization, which recruits these natural killer cells from the periphery. Throughout the first half of the pregnancy, the numbers increase tremendously, and you can see towards the mid-pregnancy, they're typically around this maternal vasculature. However, towards the term, there is a drastic reduction of the natural killer cell numbers in the maternal compartment. Interestingly, there's a reciprocal relationship between these natural killer cells and the invasive trophoblasts which move out of the placenta, because this invasive trophoblast movement occurs post the gestation, and it's very prominent towards the term. So if we want to summarize, during the first half of the pregnancy, the natural killer cells are very important components of the pregnant uterus. However, this maternal compartment is completely taken over by the invasive trophoblast cells, which then go on and remodel the vasculature. One particular point over here is that towards the term, it's really beautiful how the placenta totally functionally compartmentalizes into a junctional zone, which harbors the precursors of the invasive trophoblast lineage, and the labyrinth zone, which is more involved in the exchange of nutrients between the maternal compartment and the fetus. And needless to say, what is the most fascinating part is that this influx of uterine natural killer cells, or rather this movement of natural killer cells and its increase in the compartment, maternal compartment, is conserved across the species. A little bit of information about natural killer cells. Natural killer cells are an important arm of innate immunity. However, these uterine natural killer cells are extremely special. In a pregnant uterus, they consist up to 80% of the uterine lymphocytes. They're markedly reduced in cytotoxicity, and they are known to produce cytokines which are pro-pregnancy-genic and pro-growth promoting. to the fetus. There are a number of NK cell deficient mouse models which are available. This is one of the simplest ones. It's an IL-15, a cytokine IL-15 null mouse model. And when the placentation sites were observed in these mouse models, it was seen that as compared to the wild type, which has nicely vessels which have relatively thin smooth muscle actin layer, the NK deficient mouse models retained the thick smooth muscle actin layer indicative of lack of remodeling. So it was proposed that NK cells are involved, are key players in the vascular remodeling process. They are traditionally known to be source of angiogenic factors like VEGF-A, VEGF-C. However, there's always been a divide in the field regarding the conflicting relationship between the uterine NK cells and the invasive trophoblast cells. Now, looking at the trophoblast development site, the other arm, the other key players of the hemochorial placentation, trophoblast stem cells arise from this layer called the trophectoderm, and this is the blastocyst stage embryo, which is around day 4.5 gestation day for the rat. And let me clear out, for a rat, the total gestation term is around 21.5 years. So when I speak about big pregnancy, it would be somewhere around between day 11 to day 13. So around gestation day 4.5, the implantation event occurs, and there's a beautiful blastocyst formation with the inner cell mass, which contributes to the actual embryo. But it's the outer layer, which is known as the trophectoderm, which basically differentiates to give rise to a functional placenta, different zones that I talked about before, the junctional zone, the labyrinth zone, beautiful compartmentalization, and different lineages that arise from a very coordinated differentiation process. And I reiterate again, it's the invasive trophoblast lineage which is involved in the vascular remodeling process, and this junctional zone region harbors the precursors for the invasive trophoblast lineage. There is a particular reason as to why we use a rat model. There are numerous models of hemochorial placentation. There are guinea pig models, mouse models, rat models, primate models. Humans can be a model really, but the reason we utilize a rat model is this particular invasive behavior of the trophoblast cells, which is way more superior than the mouse, in which the trophoblast invasion is fairly modest. This arrow indicates the border of the decidua. So if you kind of check it out, if this is where the decidua ends, this is the invasion that we observe in a mouse, which in a rat is pretty robust. And this extent of invasion is pretty comparable to human models. So for all of our studies, and we would follow the rat model, as a model for placentation. So not boring you more with the background, let's delve into the actual presentation. So with all this background, what we decided, we wanted to see what is the functional role of these natural killer cells at the uteroplacental sites in a rat model of pregnancy. We used a depletion strategy, an immunodepletion strategy for depleting the natural killer cells. Anti-acylo-GM1 has been studied from 1980s, binds to acylo-GM1 on the surface of NK cells and brings about complement-mediated lysis of the natural killer cells. So it's a very important, classically used NK cell depletion strategy. We utilized this strategy, thought about a little bit, and realized that we will inject pregnant rats roundabout in the term of the implantation, which is day 4.5. And if you remember, it's around this time the NK cells are actually coming into the maternal compartment. So we've injected on day 4.5 to placentation sites out on day 9.5. When we did that, we observed beautiful depletion, statistically significant. We all need statistics. And interestingly, one point that we observed was that successfully we were also depleting the natural killer cells from the periphery. This is a flow cytometry analysis looking at the splenocytes. But the critical point was, however, the timing, because when we moved this injection to day 6.5, we were unable to deplete the natural killer cells from the placentation site. So to conclude, we found depletion works, and depletion is extremely time sensitive. Next, we wanted to see how long do we keep achieving the depleted NK cell state in the placentation site. So we thought another hallmark time for the natural killer cells is 13.5, because it's around that time the number is maximum in the maternal compartment. And when we looked at this experimental strategy, injecting on 4.5, looking all the way to 13.5, we observed that no, a single injection is unable to deplete the natural killer cells all the way up to 13.5. There was significant depletion, but we still see persistence of the natural killer cells in the uteroplacental site on day 30.5. We were not quite happy. We needed the NK cells to go away till the mid-pregnancy, the time point during which they are the real players. So we moved on. We came back around on day 9.5 and did another set of injection. And this time we were successful in depleting natural killer cells from 4.5 to gestation day 13.5. So immunodepletion works in the rats. And again, there was a dosage-dependent component to this depletion. So even when we were looking at those placentation sites for the NK cells, we noticed that there was something abnormal about the vessels, the maternal vessels, as compared to the control. I said abnormal because they look very different. If you see the vessels, this is a typical distribution of the maternal vessels out here. The placenta is right here. Beautifully huge, big diameter vessels. And we decided to see whether there was trophoblast invasion already occurring. So this brown stain, it stains for cytokeratin for the trophoblast. And interestingly, what we observe on NK cell depletion, the trophoblasts are prematurely moving out of the placenta, and they're already bringing about the endovascular movement of the cells. And these cells are positive for the typical hallmark endovascular trophoblast mark. It's prolactin family protein, which has been identified early on by the lab, and this is the in situ hybridization. And interestingly, in the control sections, maternal compartment, we do not barely see any expression of these particular marker. However, in the NK cell depleted, if we dissect out this maternal site, we see a huge upregulation of the invasive trophoblast marker. This was pretty fascinating to us. We wanted to see the same phenotype, albeit in a more genetic model. So we utilized constitutively active chicken beta-actin expressing EGFP rat model, a homozygous one or a heterozygous one. So what we typically do is we have a wild-type rat. We mate this animal, male, with the female. And in the process, what happens is in the background of the wild-type male, we can see the beautiful GFP-positive cells, which has a paternal contribution, moving out. So this would help us to visualize the trophoblast cells. And when we utilize that model, we observe that as compared to the control, if you can see the arrows over here, we already see the trophoblast cells moving out of the placenta, even with the genetic model, when we deplete the natural killer cells. So this data is real and it works. So next, we wanted to play with it a little bit. We have this, earlier I showed you that if we move the injection to gestation day 6.5 and do not achieve immunodepletion, we basically wanted to take that model and look into gestation day 13.5 to see how the invasion looks like. So this is getting the injection done all the way to 4.5 and looking at 13.5, beautiful trophoblast invasion, but it's just not there. So what it basically says is that a critical time point of depletion is necessary for the movement of the trophoblast cells for initiating the endovascular trophoblast invasion. And it is sometime very close to the implantation time point, which is day 4.5. So next, we saw those beautiful vessels. We saw trophoblasts in them. First thing that we wanted to do is look at the nature of the vessels in the placentation site. This is a little complicated slide. I'll walk you down slowly. This is a control placentation site. This is the NK-depleted placentation site. We're looking at smooth muscle actin staining for the vessels. The reason we look into smooth muscle actin is pretty simple. In the remodeled vessels, the smooth muscle actin staining would be patchy. So in control, what we saw that when the NK cells are present, there is still some extent of fatty smooth muscle actin, and this was independent of the NK cells present around the vessels. In concordance with the in vivo NK deficient mouse model, we see some of the vessels in the NK depleted which have the thick smooth muscle actin staining. Perfect, the NK depletion phenotype in terms of the smooth muscle actin expression by these vessels are pretty similar. However, interestingly, if we look at the cytokeratin staining and the smooth muscle actin staining together, in control we don't see any of the trophoblast remodeled cells having the cytokeratin positive trophoblasts in these vessels. However, in the NK cell depleted model, trophoblasts are coming into this heavily remodeled vessels and they are remodeling the maternal vasculature. Another interesting thing, we wanted to follow it up with an actual endothelial marker, PCAM1, and this is again looking at the vessels. In control, beautiful PCAM1 staining. Interestingly, the partial depleted NK cell model as well as in the complete depleted model, we see cytokeratin trophoblast cells moving into this vasculature, reiterating the patchy PCAM staining. But with the complete NK cell depletion model, we actually see beginning of the serovasculogenesis, which occurs later in the pregnancy, wherein the trophoblast cells begin to actually acquiring more endothelial specific markers. It's in this complete NK depleted model, we see this clear overlap between the cytokeratin positive cells expressing PCAM in the placentation sites. So we are bringing about a vascular remodeling, and we are observing a premature, a lot earlier pseudovasculogenesis, something that you would observe way later in the pregnancy. We wanted to look at the different zones of the placenta, the junctional zone and the labyrinth zone, and for that we use Benton staining, which stains for the mesenchymal fibers, the junctional zone is devoid of that and it's going to be negative, so it's more like a negative staining. When we do that, as compared to the control, there was a robust enhancement of the junctional zone in the NK depleted placentation sites. And this was statistically significant. Okay, so very nice set of observations, but something, we thought that we have seen this before. Where have we seen this before? A few years back, one of the postdocs in our lab, Dr. Rosario, she had observed a very interesting observation. And it is when the pregnant rats are exposed to low oxygen in a hypoxic chamber between a very critical gestation time point from gestation day 6.5 to 13.5, there was robust endovascular trophoblast movement, which was very reminiscent, or is very reminiscent of what we have seen in our NK depleted model. There was expansion of the junctional zone region. And what was very interesting, she could basically kind of narrow it down to a window of just 24 hours. So if she exposed the pregnant animals in this 24 hours, she could elicit a movement of the trophoblast cells into the maternal compartment. And this was not observed if you moved away from this particular 24-hour period. That is, if you move away from 8.5 to 9.5, if you expose the animals post 9.5, she could never get the endovascular trophoblast movement. So this time point was very critical and got our attention into it. And we decided to look early on between this 24 hours to see what was the placentation site like in our NK depleted models. So this is a classical cartoon of day 9.5 rat placentation site. This is the early primordial placenta, also commonly known as ectoplacental cone. The embryo sits right in here. And these are the maternal vessels slowly connecting, making a connection with the placenta, and lots of natural killer cells around them. And interestingly, it's around in this gestation day 8.5 that chorioallantoid fusion occurs, which helps in development of the placenta. The branching morphogenesis of the placenta really is the foundation of the adult or the mature placenta, as we know. So we wanted to look at this placentation site, and when we looked, compared the control and the NK depleted, and looked for the vessel markers, PCAM1 and smooth muscle actin, we could see as compared to the control, there was significant reduction in the density of the vasculature in the maternal compartment. It was statistically significant. Interestingly also, when we look at the different angiogenic factors which the NK cells are supposed to produce, there was a marked downregulation. Not a surprise, because NK cells are a very big source of these angiogenic factors. And we also looked at the protein level of these one particular angiogenic factor, VEGF-A, and it was also downregulated at the protein level. So what we basically observed is that there is a developmental delay in the spiral artery development on NK cell depletion. So we tracked it down. We looked a little later, because the vessels are coming back when we are looking at gestation day 13.5. So we wanted to backtrack it. We looked at gestation day 11.5. And when we look at the placentation sites, indeed, the vessels are sprouting back in. But the vessels definitely, as compared to the control, have already started looking a little different. At this point, it got us into thinking, and we were thinking what could possibly be the impact be of this vessel, reducing vessel density. So the vessels are responsible for oxygen delivery to the developing placenta. So we wanted to see what was the oxygen tension like at the placentation site. We utilized a compound known as pimonidazole compound, which forms adducts with hypoxic tissues. You inject it before sacrificing the animal. And when you look back into the placentation site and probe for an antibody against it, you can see beautiful staining in the hypoxic regions. When we did that, we observed that there was significant intensive staining around the developing placenta, ectoplacental cone region, as compared to the control on NK cell depletion. And these regions were also beginning to be positive. There were pockets of regions being positive for HIF1 alpha, which is a classical transcription factor downstream of hypoxia pathway. All right. So a common question that comes in our mind is, was this a direct effect of hypoxia on the trophoblast cells, and how do we study that? In order to study that, we shifted to our rat trophoblast stem cell model. And this is a general cartoon trying to show you that this is a beautiful system, I love it. And all the different lineages can be stage specifically tracked with different markers. That's the beauty of this model. So we utilized the rat trophoblast stem cell model, and before utilizing that, we wanted to do one more experiment wherein we wanted to compare the development of the placentation sites in terms of the actual gene expressions between the NK cell depleted and the hypoxia exposed animal model. When we looked at the general gene expression changes, dissecting out the placentation site, we observed that there was a tremendous similarity between the NK cell depletion as well as the hypoxia exposed models. All different genes which are reminiscent or which are important for the trophoblast invasion, they're going up, like PRL71, which I mentioned already, PRLA5A1, TPBPA, which I'm going to follow up a lot bit. So overall, there was an upregulation of junctional zone type markers in the NK cell depleted as well as the low oxygen treated animals. And we followed it up with the protein expression of TPBPA. And when we looked the placentation sites of the NK cell depleted and the 8.5% treated animals, pockets of TPBPA positive cells started appearing, which was not observed at this time point in control placentation sites. So we wanted to move on in vitro, trying to see the effects of low oxygen signaling in these trophoblast cells, and Dr. Asanoma from our lab established the rat trophoblast stem cells from the blastocysts, which can be maintained with ref conditioned media and FGF4. And when you remove FGF4 and ref conditioned media, these cells can be actually differentiated. And they go, it's a multi-lineage process, they go in all different lineages of the trophoblast. Using this rat trophoblast stem cell model, we exposed the animals to the cells to low oxygen. And before we go into those set of experiments, I want to talk a little bit about the hypoxia signaling pathway mediated by the HIF transcription factors. In a normoxic condition, when oxygen is enough and it's ambient condition, HIF1 alpha is not stable in the protein level. It gets degraded, and because of certain hydroxylations on the proline residues by the prolyl hydroxylases PHD2 and PHD3, which are also oxygen sensitive, and the hydroxylated HIF1 alpha then gets proteasomally degraded by the non-HIF-1 ring of proteins, which is a ubiquitin ligase. However, under low oxygen tensions, this PHD, the prolyl hydroxylases, they are inhibited because they need oxygen for their activity. And HIF1 alpha dimerizes with its partner, HIF1 beta, which is also known as ARNT. It can sit on the responsive genes and bring about a very specific gene expression involved in the metabolism, angiogenesis, differentiation, and invasion and metastasis. The reason I bring it about in here is that poor placentation related to the pathology and linking poor pathology to the HIF transcription factors is extensively studied. However, there is very little literature on the instructive role of these transcription factors and instructive role of the low oxygen signaling directing the placental development, and especially the time-sensitive role of low oxygen signaling. So we decided, in order to address some of those interesting questions, we utilized the rat trophoblast stem cell model. We exposed the trophoblast stem cells for 24 hours to low oxygen. And when we did that, interestingly again, the junctional zone type markers kind of literally showed up, with a downregulation of other lineage markers, prominently the labyrinth zone markers. And also, what was interesting is that these cells seem to be more invasive as assessed by Matrigel invasion assay experiments. In the next set of experiments, we downregulated the common binding partner, which dimerizes with HIF alpha proteins. HIF also has a component of HIF2 alpha, which can dimerize with a common constitutive binding partner, which is known as HIF1 beta, also known as ARNT. We wanted to disrupt the signaling pathway by disrupting HIF1 beta. And when we do that, we see the hypoxia responsive genes are getting downregulated, indicative of an active HIF signaling pathway going on in these cells. These are some of the classical members. Interestingly, the TPBPA effect that we saw on increasing under low oxygen tension, it also gets dampened, showing a direct relationship of HIF signaling pathways and promotion of the invasive trophoblast lineage. We validated it using immunostaining with the cells, and there was robust upregulation of TPBPA, which we did not observe in HIF1 beta treated, shRNA treated cells. Next, we looked into some of the more invasive markers. We screened for MMP12, shows a robust upregulation, which kind of goes down when the HIF pathway is inhibited. So is MMP9, and interestingly, E-cadherin, which is involved in the epithelial mesenchymal transition, one of the important junctional proteins, which is downregulated in the mesenchymal cells, or cells which are going through this transition, was downregulated on hypoxia exposure, goes back up in when we knock down the HIF signaling pathway. And when we looked into our Matrigel assay chambers, we observed a very similar pattern with very robust trophoblast invasion in the control cells. However, it's significantly reduced when the HIF signaling pathway is downregulated. So to summarize the first part of my talk, we believe that the NK cells, through the angiogenic factors, have effects on the uterine spiral arteries, which is the main source of the way that cells developing placenta senses the oxygen, has a direct effect on these TS cells, which overall promotes alterations in lineage decisions, moving the cells more towards the invasive lineage. Just mentioning the facts back in the bullets. Overall, the main, one of the strongest aspects of this set of information was that we have this beautiful in vitro system of trophoblast stem cells, which basically mimic the in vivo results that we observed in our system. So with this, we really got interested in trying to see what are the trophoblast stem cell adaptations to low oxygen signaling. So we wanted to really get into the mechanism of this development of invasive trophoblast lineage development. We used the same experimental model wherein we exposed the rat trophoblast stem cells, again, just 24 hours to low oxygen, collected RNA, sent the samples down to our bioinformatics core for a microarray analysis. It was a very nice microarray done in triplicate, and there were 786 genes which were upregulated, and also 838 genes which were downregulated. So we didn't see a skewing to a particular gene expression direction. So there were nice distribution of upregulated and downregulated genes. When we fed the microarray results into the ingenuity pathway analysis, we observed, very interestingly, that genes involved in cellular movement, tumor morphology, was significantly upregulated. There was a whole network of genes which were showing up as upregulated genes in our microarray. And cell-to-cell signaling and interaction, more junctional protein type genes, were significantly getting downregulated in the cells which were exposed to low oxygen, which kind of reinstates our whole data on the role of the hypoxia signaling on the trophoblast invasion. We next started validating some of those genes. I just wanted to give you a snapshot of the different genes that we saw. Interestingly, the classical hypoxia responsive markers were all upregulated, can be seen in multiple literatures. A lot of cell movement, ECM remodeling genes were also represented, and some of them you've already seen. When we looked at the downregulated genes, we observed a very interesting trend wherein the trophoblast stem type genes, a whole assortment of them, and I've just included some, there are others, so had shown downregulated traits, and it includes ID1, SADB1, CDH2, they all were downregulated under low oxygen temperatures. So we are bringing about some sort of change in the trophoblast cells, which were sort of pushing them more towards a differentiated lineage, and precisely from our experiments more towards an invasive differentiated lineage. We next wanted to observe the HIF-dependent actions of these genes, whether all of these genes were dependent classically on hypoxia signaling, because when you expose the cells or expose anything to hypoxia, there are some non-HIF pathways which gets upregulated too and which can contribute to some of the gene expression changes. So for that, we utilized again our HIF1 beta shRNA knockdown model. We knocked down HIF1 beta, and interestingly, I'm not going to go through every gene, but there was a very nice linear relation between HIF expression, the hypoxia signaling pathway, and the upregulated genes. All of these gene expressions dampened when we knocked down the HIF signaling pathway. However, why do I say it's interesting? When we move on to the HIF1 beta downregulated genes, a subset of them showed a direct HIF response. However, there are quite a few genes which did not show a direct HIF response, which indicates other hypoxia mediated but non-HIF mediated pathways maybe are involved in bringing about gene expression changes for a subset of the hypoxia regulated, downregulated genes. So we decided from this microarray, we decided to pursue one of the global regulators, which would give us the most robust data. No, I'm just joking. One of the global regulators, which is going to help us to find the actual mechanism of development of the invasive trophoblast lineage. So we decided to follow KDM3A, which is a classical hypoxia responsive target shown by many different groups, including Dr. Craig, who's sitting right there. And we decided to follow KDM3A. It's a histone H3K9 demethylase. So it demethylates H3K9 monomethyl and dimethyl, and I'll be talking more about this later. Before we move into histone tails and modifications, just a very simplistic slide to get us acquainted with the general chromatin organization. Within a cell, the chromatin consists mostly of the DNA and different proteins that interact with the DNA. In a very simplistic model, the genetic material needs to be packaged in a way so that when there are certain stimuli, some developmental processes like replication, transcription, DNA damage, or cell division, the DNA can be instantly wrapped out of the thick of the condensed state. So one of the most condensed state of chromatin organization is a metapose chromosome, and these little values, just for your eyes only, are the relative thicknesses of the different phases of the chromatin structure. So if we take out a metaphase chromosome, really look into the functional units, if we could, under the microscope, we would see this beautiful beads on a string structure. We are all acquainted with it. But what is interesting is that the DNA wrapping around the histone octamer, consisting of these different histone subunits, has, particularly the histone proteins, they have these N-terminal tails which can be modified. There can be different kinds of modifications in this histone N-terminal tails, but typically there are some modifications which are more favorable for keeping the chromatin in a more exposed open condition, making it more accessible as compared to the others. So in a normal unstimulated state, when you don't want a gene to be expressed, you definitely want to restore some energy and kind of put the chromatin back in a very condensed state, known as heterochromatin, and have the unfavorable histone modifications, which are chemical modifications on the tails. And this greatly makes the transcription factor inaccessible. However, when there is an external stimulus and you really need quick transcriptional upregulation, certain chromatin modifiers bring about favorable histone tail modifications, which would make the chromatin more accessible, make the transcription factors more accessible to the free DNA for gene expression. So realistically, you should keep this picture in mind and get reminded of these tail modifications, the good ones, the activating ones, and the inactivating ones, which basically regulate the transcriptional machinery in the cells. So with this background, we zoomed into the histone H3, and it's this beautiful purple N-terminal tails. We are focusing into this particular lysine residue, which is lysine K, and this histone 3 lysine 9 can have 3 different states of methylations, the monomethylation, di, and tri. It is known that the trimethylation and the dimethylations are more repressive marks, and what KDM3A basically does is that it demethylates the monomethylation to a no methylation state. It can also demethylate a dimethylated state to more monomethylated state. A little bit of trivia, it's a Jumonji C domain containing protein, demethylase, which classically means it's a cupene metalloenzyme, which in simplistically is a very typical 8 beta barrel structure with an active iron in its core, which is necessary for its enzymatic activity. And it also requires alpha ketoglutarate for its activity as a cofactor. So we decided to follow KDM3A in our trophoblast dependent adaptations that we observed in our TS cells. First, we looked at our cells and the exposed cells, the cells exposed to low oxygen. KDM3A was robustly upregulated. There was a beautiful time course pattern of KDM3 in terms of the protein expression. And also, the cells became significantly positive for KDM3A. Interestingly, KDM3A also has a couple of other members in the family, KDM3B and KDM3C. They do not seem to be hypoxia responsive, or they are not upregulated in the transcript level on exposure to low oxygen conditions in the rat TS cells. We validated this data. We looked in vivo in our 24-hour in vivo model exposure of hypoxia. Again, beautiful, robust upregulation of KDM3A. Very nice upregulation in the protein level, and punctate but strong upregulation in the trophoblast cells of the ectoplacental cone, the developing placenta. This is looking again at gestation day 9.5. Next, a very important observation that Mike has always taught me is that if we are looking at a gene, whether how much biologically relevant that gene is. So we just had these lysates of trophoblast differentiated cells, as well as the in vivo lysates and placentation sites of different time points of gestation. And we just wanted to see what is the KDM3 expression like in those two different systems. When we looked at the in vitro cells, interestingly on differentiation, there is significant upregulation of the transcript and protein level of KDM3A. And also, when you looked at different day placentation sites, at gestation day 9.5, it's extremely low, it's not there. There is a huge upregulation of day 11.5, but which kind of goes down. But it's still significantly upregulated as compared to gestation day 9.5. And this was also observed in the protein level. What it typically signifies, I just want to mention over here that it's this day 11.5 when actual placental zones of the junctional zone and labyrinth zones are taking place. So it is the time point where the demarcation of the different zones are beginning to happen. Slowly it will get compartmentalized into two different compartments, which I mentioned, the junctional and the labyrinth. When we looked at the immunostaining, pockets of KDM3A in the placentation sites, very robust signal on day 11.5, which is basically not there on day 9.5. Again, it drops on day 13.5. Next, so to summarize this part, KDM3A is a biologically important target. It's expressed in the differentiated trophoblast cells and also in the placentation cells. Next, we wanted to look at human placentation sites. What we observed that in the first trimester samples, there was robust upregulation, strong staining of KDM3A, which goes down around the term, which is not a surprise. Interestingly, at term, the interstitial trophoblast cells pick up the robust KDM3A signals back again. So basically signifying the invasive trophoblast cells are expressing KDM3A and not much expression in the syncytial trophoblast lineage. So next, our classical experiment, we moved on to looking at KDM3A knockdown model. We utilized shRNAs to knock down KDM3A. There was, and we could identify two shRNAs which knock down KDM3A to a very minimal level, also in the protein level. We utilized these shRNAs. We infected our trophoblast stem cells to these KDM3 shRNAs and basically compared the gene expression changes that we observed on our hypoxia exposure. Interestingly, some of the hypoxia, subset of hypoxia responsive targets are also KDM3 targets. And there were also some of the hypoxia targets or hypoxia responsive genes which were unaffected by KDM3 knockout. Next, we utilized these trophoblast stem cells, knocked down trophoblast stem cells, and we exposed these cells to low oxygen. As compared to the ambient conditions, control conditions, knocking down KDM3A in the hypoxic situations severely downregulated trophoblast invasion. So this is again looking at the low oxygen treated trophoblast invasion that we've observed before, but when we knock down KDM3A, we basically lose the invasive capability imparted by the HIF signaling pathway, and this was statistically significant. We also utilized another method to see the invasive capability of the cells. So it's a common assay, outgrowth assay, which has been performed for a really long time. The first paper I found out when I was writing the thesis was way back in 1984. So what is typically done is the zona is removed from the blastocyst, and then the blastocyst is plated for outgrowth assess. Here what we did was we removed the zona and we infected the blastocyst with virus, KDM3 shRNA expressing virus. It will infect only the outer trophectoderm layer, leaving the inner cell mass intact, which is unaffected by the KDM3 shRNAs because the virus really can't penetrate the inner cell mass. And when we utilize this blastocyst, let them to grow for a couple of days and expose them to low oxygen, we observed that as compared to the control, which shows a robust outgrowth, the KDM3A shRNA treated blastocyst did not show a more as robust outgrowth. So clearly KDM3A knockdown is having a role in the trophoblast invasion. This was all the hypoxia effects of or low oxygen signaling effects on KDM3A. There are some reports in cancer studies that KDM3A expression ectopically can have some role on the invasive capability of the cancer cells. Keeping those experiments in mind, and also some of the studies looking at differentiation and role of KDM3A in the differentiation process, we decided to ectopically upregulate KDM3A in ambient conditions in the trophoblast stem cell state, wherein the KDM expression is extremely low or not there. When we did that, and this is, we utilized a flag TAT, classical pCDNF3 overexpression approach. When we utilize this technique, we can overexpress very nicely KDM3A. And what we observed is that some of the KDM3A hypoxia responsive genes, not all of them, they are getting upregulated in the ambient conditions on KDM3A ectopic expression. This made us really interested to see utilize the matrigel invasion assay to see the role of KDM3A in the trophoblast invasion. And when we utilized the same experimental setup, we observed robust upregulation of invasion, significant invasion in the cells in ambient conditions but ectopically expressing KDM3A. So next, KDM3A is a demethylase. We wanted to see, like a lot of other groups have done before, the demethylase activity of the KDM3, and for that we looked at the two different substrates, the H3K9 dimethyl and the monomethyl marks, as I have mentioned before. So we looked for enrichment of these substrates on the KDM3A responsive genes under low oxygen tensions. So we utilized ambient cells and low oxygen exposed cells, and we looked at the proximal promoter region of MMP12 gene, which is a KDM3A responsive gene, and we looked for the enrichment of monomethyl and dimethylation marks. When we looked for the monomethylation mark, there was significant downregulation of the enrichment of monomethylation mark, which is enzymatically very interesting. You can signify that your KDM3A is probably acting on the monomethyl substrate. Also, we saw a very similar pattern on the dimethyl marks, which also went down on hypoxia exposure in the proximal promoter region of the MMP12 gene. However, what kind of caught our attention was monomethylation mark is classically known to be an activator or more active gene expression mark. What's going on with that? We read back, we got into the literature and read through some of the papers which have reported in various different cell lines and different oxygen tensions that hypoxia can promote global methylation changes in the cell types. So in order to look into that aspect, we had all the antibodies. We basically looked at some of those methylation marks, which I'll be talking a little later. But before that, I just thought of putting in one slide, trying to show the importance of MMP12, how the MMP12 is relevant for our study. So MMP12 is upregulated on hypoxia exposure, even in vivo. And we also had this in unpublished data in the lab, which showed that in our in vivo low oxygen exposure model, MMP12 is getting heavily expressed in the maternal compartment as compared to the control placentation sites. And when we looked at this, when we focus into this remodeled vessels that we spoke about early on, we observed that the invasive trophoblast cells which line these vessels express MMP12. This is the in situ hybridization of MMP12. And these remodeled vessels have very low elastin expression, which is a substrate for MMP12. So this really sort of reinstated our observation regarding MMP12 and how MMP12 can actually be very important biologically, and how the whole story kind of gets into a really, really nice linear pathway. So going back to the histone modifications that we were talking about, we looked at, it was a very simple experiment. We had this protein lysates and we looked at the histone modifications comparing the ambient exposed trophoblast cells and the low oxygen exposed trophoblast cells. Interestingly, there was robust downregulation and very reproducible global downregulation of H3K9 monomethyl and dimethyl marks. And we kind of validated that using immunohistochemistry. I will draw your attention more to the monomethyl because the differences are more robust. This is an ambient exposed controlled trophoblast cell colony, beautiful monomethyl mark representation, which is significantly downregulated on hypoxia exposure. In our next set of experiments, we utilized the KDM3A shRNA treated models, treated cell lines, and looked for these methylation mark changes. When we do that, let me draw your attention to this part of the panel. In under control shRNA treated cells under low oxygen, we see a robust downregulation of this monomethylation and dimethylation mark. We seem to catch up back on when we knock down KDM3A. So we are getting a significant recovery of these monomethyl and dimethyl marks, and trimethylation mark results were not very significantly different. We wanted to follow it up a little bit in vivo too, and we took those placentation sites and looked for the monomethyl and dimethylation mark. Again, a robust, very reproducible changes in the monomethylation mark. And when we look at the actual placentation sites, day 9.5, we see that in control, beautifully defined cells expressing very robust H3K9 monomethylation mark, which is much lower, signal in hypoxia exposed samples and has a very different distribution of this particular histone methylation mark. So, to conclude the second part, we believe trophoblast cells, this is a beautiful trophoblast cell colony expressing